What's the worst workplace accident at your work? Back when I was a teenager working at Walmart, we had a huge dude start with us in the back room. The rest of us had no idea why they hired him for this kind of work, because he was over 400 pounds. Sure enough, not even an hour into his first shift, we get a truck, and on our dock, the crossover ramp has a small opening on each end. The dude steps in with his one leg and falls hard. He broke his arm so bad that we had no clue how we were going to get him out. The ramp is about 15 feet in the air, and he was so big that pulling 400 pounds just using his one arm was impossible. So a couple coworkers had to go outside on a ladder and push him up while we pulled. He got his arm in an air cast and quit. Worst part is, we were 4 days away from a free pizza party for 90 days of no work-related accident or injury. Story 2. Two of my employees were putting up stuff on a marquee for a theater. The ladder collapses, the one on it falls, and somehow the one on the ground takes the ladder to the head. Both went to the hospital. The other that stands out of my mind was my own. Employee spills something and doesn't clean it up. I come through and slip, tearing the MCL in my knee. Crawling and dragging myself away trying not to scream was not the happiest day. Story 3. You decide which is worse. Worked for Cessna Aircraft, guy working a punch press, didn't remove the slugs, and eventually too many were there. Hit into his chest, little aluminum discs about 2-inch diameter. Think it actually hit his heart. Some years after that, I was a bowling alley mechanic. One of the other mechanics at one of the other alleys the company owned stayed late to clean the top of the decks that sets the pins down. Next morning, the manager came in and saw his feet on a lane, like he was standing there. When he didn't answer, she went back and found him passed away. He didn't shut the machine all the way down, and the deck tried to go back up with him between it and the upper parts of the machine. They guessed it took a couple hours for him to pass. Story 4. Death warning. I was working a night outage in a large substation. There were 2 teams, testing and maintenance, and I was leading the test team. I was the main testing engineer, and each time I scheduled a test on a piece of equipment, the station's maintenance group would also use that same outage to do some routine maintenance, clean, re-oil, etc. We had scheduled 2 outages. My team would be testing on one while they did routine maintenance on another, and then we would exchange. This is at 2 a.m., low electric load period, so easier to take outages. And as I am testing, I see a large light and a boom. I turn, and at the other end of the station saw a glowing body fly 20 meters through the air and land in a glowing heap. And amidst the glow, the hair on his head was on fire. The guy fought for 10 days and passed away. I checked the relays the next day. 50,000 amps had flown through him to ground. A fraction of an amp in the right place can hit you. 50,000 amps will cook everything. The stupid lead at that station had cut some important steps so he could go home early. For electric guys, half of a 220 kilovolt disconnect they were performing maintenance on was charged from the standby bus that they had not isolated. The lead did not check for charge. The union lead did not try to ground it. The lockout-tagout process was not followed. Story 5. Medical student. I wasn't present for it, but a nurse had an accidental needle stick with a needle contaminated with blood from an HIV+ patient. She took prophylaxis and didn't end up contracting AIDS, but that would have scared the crap out of me. Story 6. Used to work at an Amazon warehouse. A dude I worked with went to pick an item off the top shelf that he couldn't see, and when he did, he got a face full of random semen. It was a fleshlight that someone else had apparently unwrapped and taken it to the bathroom before putting it back on the shelf. Needless to say, the guy got a complimentary STD test from the company. Story 7. Former work as of 2 months ago, but it answers the question, how the hell do you get injured working at a radio station? The building I worked in was old, built in the 1930s, a piece of broadcasting history and the birthplace of the career of the person who would go on to create the late-night television talk show. But while the interior of the building had been rebuilt and repurposed over the decades since, there were parts of it that were still crap. Most of the 3rd floor was condemned due to pervasive asbestos, and there was an old roof access point that finally claimed a victim a few years back. This guy was one of our engineers, a few years from retirement and an absolute joy to work with. Funny, skilled, and genuinely a good guy. One day he was climbing up through the roof access, and the heavy door, kind of like a hatch, broke loose and came down on his head. At first he seemed a bit dazed, but pretty soon it became apparent that he'd been badly hurt. He was rushed to the hospital, and while he survived, he was never the same, never able to return to work. His plans to retire cut short, and he wound up on disability and having to live in constant pain. The company swept it under the rug. Only a few people knew the full extent of his injuries, and they kept it that way. Before I knew all this, I'd made a joke in the presence of the HR person about the worst injury that was possible at a radio station, and her head snapped around, and she looked at me like, if you only knew. There was never any fundraiser to help pay for his care, or any celebration of his service to the company, or anything except silence. I'm sure he was taken care of financially as laid out in our pretty decent benefits, but they kept what happened really quiet, and that's a damn shame. Story 8. There was a 5 inches by 16 inches metal plate on top of a ladder. Guy moved the ladder, and the plate came flying down at an angle. He was wearing shorts, and the plate hit his calf with the sharpest angle it could possibly achieve, and so much blood. Story 9. I have two, actually. Used to work in a supermarket deli. The first one, a girl opened the slicer blade while she was cleaning it, turned the slicer on, and then proceeded to hit the palm of her hand off when she wiped down the blade. Yep, that was an instant termination and a trip to the hospital. Next one, a guy stood on top of the fryer while it was on to clean the fryer vents, which were built into the wall above the fryers. He slipped and his leg went into 338 degrees grease up to his knee. He was also instantly terminated and got a helicopter ride to Tallahassee to visit the burn unit. Moral of both stories, use your brains and some common sense. It could save you a lot of pain and a job search. Story 10, a guy lost his finger on a bandsaw. I was off sick that day and didn't see that one, but another bad one I actually saw right in front of me was a guy getting his entire forearm hit by a steel plate that spun around while it was hanging from a crane. Story 11. Worked as an on-site medic with an oil field company. Derek Hand works at the top of the rig, didn't tie on with his harness. Not sure what happened, but they fell from the top of the derrick all the way to the ground. They exploded from the inside, but didn't pass. Being the medic, it was my responsibility to keep them alive. Ever try giving mouth to someone that's just oozing blood? Would not recommend. They passed. And now I've got hemophobia. Story 12. Worked at trampoline park, and one of my fellow staff members did a flip to show off and snap their leg like a twig. Now staff are not allowed to flip while on duty. Story 13. Not my current job, but a previous one. I worked at a high-tension transmission tower construction. One guy was on a tower fixing one cable. The electric line was off, but a storm not so far was approaching. Somehow the storm caused an induced shock on the line, and that guy, who was not with the proper gloves, got the shock and fell towards the ground. He was using an L rope and belt and did not hit the ground. He was passed out by some minutes before rescue arrived. Fortunately, he survived with just a dizziness. Story 14. I'm a vet tech. One of my coworkers got bit in the face by a very large terrier mix. She only narrowly avoided losing an eye. I was bitten on 3 separate occasions by cats. Each time the bite got infected. All 3 cases involved unvaccinated animals with neurological symptoms and unknown histories. Prime rabies suspects, basically. My own worst injury happened when I was trying to help a paralyzed dog out of kennel. We had large kennels that closed with a fence gate. She was a large German shepherd and pulled away at just the wrong time. The force pulled me down face first into the top of the gate's supporting pole. I'm still not sure how I didn't bust a few teeth. I looked like a chipmunk for a few weeks. Story 15. I worked in a prison. An officer was sitting at his desk doing computer work when an inmate walked up and slugged him in the head, knocking him to the floor. The inmate then jumped on top of the officer and stabbed him multiple times with a homemade knife. Fortunately, the officer survived, but he never returned to work. The reason for the assault: the inmate wanted to be transferred to another prison. Story 16. This one time I had just finished stacking the yogurt in the dairy section, and then one of my towers fell down. It took like 5 whole seconds to put it back up. Story 17. An incinerator plant I was working on had a worker fall from the top of the 750-foot stack onto a 2x4 below during construction. He exploded on impact, I was told. Story 18. Small, pudgy Mexican I work with thought it would be funny to drop the garage-style door just high enough where only his 4 feet 11 inches self could walk under. Our 6 foot 7 inch employee wasn't paying attention, walking with his head down, and leveled himself by walking into it. He got a mild concussion, but the best part was we had shut down business for 5 minutes because we were laughing too hard to do any work. Story 19. Not work, but school. A kid passed out in class. He later died in the hospital. Didn't know him personally, but still really sad. The school planted a tree in the recess area to remember him by. Story 20. Office environment. We had a lady miss her chair and crack her tailbone. That's about as edgy as it gets. Kept the one guy that went ducking psycho and threw a chair across the cubes, but that's not technically an accident. Story 21. I worked in a warehouse with high bay racking. There was a huge bang and a call goes out on the radios for a first aider to aisle 23. I was not a first aider for this company, although I was still current as a combat medic from my time in the military, and had been told during my induction a few months previous, we have lots of first aiders. If there's an incident, then let them deal with it. This will become important in a moment. About a minute later, another, much more panicked call goes out on the radio for 2 more first aider to aisle 23. As I was working in a back office with a colleague who was also a qualified first aider, but not for this company. As this was at about 5 a.m., and we knew that there were probably only 2 first aiders in the entire building, the 2 of us decide, let's just go see if we can help, and head out to aisle 23, where we are met with carnage. A pallet of wooden furniture had fallen onto a forklift truck from the top rack, which is about 50 feet up. Instead of staying in the reinforced metal, the driver panicked and tried to get out. He is now trapped and bleeding under half a ton of flat-packed wood. Both legs hurt. The first aider, who walked into this mess, instantly fainted and hit their head. While my colleague dealt with the fractured skull, I went into full military make crap happen fast mode and dealt with Pallet Boy. Both survived and are now fine. Fractured Skull was off for 6 months and never wanted to be a first aider after that. Pallet Boy was off for 18 months, had to have reconstruction surgery on both legs from the thighs down. We both got a personal thanks from the head of the company. Story 22. So a few years ago, I worked in a place manufacturing hydraulic hoses. One of the steps is after the hose is complete, you stick the end between these jaws that crimp down and pressurize the hose to check for leaks. I'm talking thousands of PSI, so they really clamp down. Cue dumbass who thinks he sees something stuck between the jaws. He sticks his finger in to clean them out and leans on the activation button with the other hand. The hose is fed through the wall into the jaws, so I'm on the other side and just see a glob of blood shoot past me. He then refused a substances test because I quote, "I just did some med on break." He told the EMT Story 23 was present for a laborer getting his leg hurt by a 500-pound stack of drywall. It was leaned up against a wall, and someone caught the edge of it with a hose, with enough force to knock the whole stack over. Poor guy rocks a desk job in a wheelchair now. Story 24. I was working in fast food. My work had a walk and freezer, and the floor would need to be cleaned every few days. My manager started to clean the floor, not realizing she didn't put the antifreeze cleaner in the water. She then got called away, got distracted, and walked away and forgot about the water in the freezer. So obviously it froze into a solid sheet of ice. One of the cooks walked in with pot of frying oil and slipped, and it went all over him. I honestly could hear his screams every time I walked into the freezer for month Story 25. Supposedly, someone didn't torque a lug, but to spec, and a customer got a mile or two before the wheel wobbled itself off in a parking lot and the car balanced on the remaining 3. Story 26. Slammed my thumb in the safe while finishing up the nightly deposit. I got blood everywhere in that office. Didn't break my thumb, thank God. Had to wear a splint for a bit, which was annoying. Also lost thumbnail. Story 27. My first job was at Panera Bread. While I was there for just over 6 months, there were 2 thumbs lost. Someone hurt his hand on the meat slicer. This was the same guy as one of the thumbs, but the other hand. I hit my hand on the tomato slicer, stored improperly and not connected, so the blade fell when I picked it up, and hit my hand on a knife on 2 separate occasions. Assholes I worked with kept throwing them in the soapy water and then laughing when I hit my hand on them. They were supposed to be placed in a special tray next to the wash water. It's why I eventually quit. Someone also had a seizure while holding a tray full of dirty plates and hit her hip when they thrashed on the ceramic shards from the plate she dropped. She ended up needing surgery because she bled so much. Story 28. Not exactly an accident, but my office at the local university was comically destroyed after the November 30th earthquake this past year. No one was hurt, so it was honestly almost laughable how absolutely demolished our office's kitchen and conference room were. Story 29. I work in a slaughterhouse. This happened a couple years before I started there. One of the guys on the cleanup crew was inside a large grinder cleaning it out without it locked out. A co-worker turned it on to rotate the mixing shaft, not realizing the other guy was still in there. The guy in the mixer had this legs and lower torso. Guy was still alive in the machine when they shut it off. They helicoptered in an emergency surgeon and staff to remove the parts and separate him from the machine. He survived. Story 30. Guy got his arm stuck in a bandsaw. It was old and had no emergency shutoff. Hit his arm to the bone. He permanently screwed up his hand and lost fine motor skill. The must ducked up part? The manager forced him to sit in the office and fill out an indecent report before calling an ambulance. Threatened to fire the guy unless he signed a paper saying that he wouldn't sue, and then the company fired him after his OSHA mandated missed workdays and he was supposed to come back to work. Story 31. Not mine, but a close friend's story. In this steel factory, there was a 500-pound cleaver that would cut the curved poles. Well, it's a 2-man job where you push the stop button, reach in and pull the steel through, then hit the button and let the cleaver drop. Well, if you don't hit the safety buttons, it cuts the time in half, therefore making your workday shorter. These 2 dudes were with the company for life. 3 years from retirement with full everything, and they weren't using the safety button. One guy doesn't get his left hand out in time and he lost it, but since the cleaver is so sharp, he didn't realize it until he reached for the next piece. And his partner saw the blood spewing. They brought every employee through the room as safety lesson, and he said the hand was still moving when he went through. Story 32. Some guys were racing around the warehouse with the company's forklifts during lunchtime and hit the new guy right through his heart. It was his first job after school and it was his second day. He died on impact, according to emergency personnel. The break rooms for the office workers in the upper floors have big glass windows facing the inside of the warehouse to make this incident even worse. Story 33. I work with horses, so I've seen my fair share of accidents. Broken bones and concussions are fairly common for the rider. One that stands up is when I saw a young horse break her shoulder. I may be somewhat used to dealing with human injury, but seeing a giant animal break a substantial bone was pretty harrowing. She was cantering with a rider and fell. Rider was hurt, but recovered. Immediate realization that the shoulder had snapped and the mare had to be euthanized quickly was like a scene from a movie. It was pouring rain, and all I could do is cradle her head and try to prevent her from trying to stand until the vet came with the green dream and then a trailer to cart her body away. Story 34. A guy had to get his leg amputated because he was cutting a piece of wood with a saw while not holding it, and it got flung into his leg and they couldn't remove it in time. My friend told me this story in such detail, I almost threw up. Story 35. I work at a recycling plant, and my supervisor probably has the most brutal. We throw cardboard onto this link that brings it up to this belt that takes it a good ways down the building into a bay of cardboard. Well, my supervisor jammed the belt somehow. I'm not sure if it was too much cardboard at once or just too big of a piece, but he gets up there and starts pushing on the belt, trying to get the belt moving. Snapped his Achilles tendon and had to have someone carry him off of it onto a forklift, which was probably even more dangerous than just going up there, but yeah. I honestly can't even picture how this would ever happen, but somehow he did. He was standing on a different belt that carries stuff up and just drops it into this baler. Well, he was sorting through aluminum on this belt, and he managed to get his heel into this weird position where this metal flap was hanging down, and someone started the belt up while he was on it. It looked pretty brutal to me. He got a huge check for both of those, though. Story 36. This was before I worked for the company I'm at, but still, it was probably the worst thing that happened there. I work at a warehouse, and we have a machine that crushes boxes and makes them into a cube shape. It's supposed to have a sensor that stops the machine when something is in the way, but it stopped working without their knowledge. So this guy brings a girl into work and tries to impress her by sticking his arm in the machine saying, "Watch, the machine will stop," maybe to show bravery or something, but it didn't stop. I don't know what happened to him or if he lost his arm, but I remember my old manager telling that story to me when I started. Story 37. Guy was working on a lighting fixture in a man lift about 25 to 30 feet up. He didn't lock out/tag out the overhead crane, which somebody on the other side of the floor began to use. It knocked the man lift over with him inside of it. Guy survived and now gets away with things like, "I can't come to work, my car's frozen solid to the ground." Story 38. At my school's workshop, we're a theater school. I wasn't there, but our table saw was broken one weekend when we came in. They told us why. Someone had pushed the wood into the saw and leaned to try and catch it on the other side before it fell. Thankfully, my teacher saw it and hit the emergency stop, and their shirt was the only thing that was sliced, and some got in and malfunctioned it. Story 39. A tree fell on the head of a guy on the shooting range. These things you only see in comedies or only heard of. But I saw that tree meticulously falling at the exact spot the guy would walk on. I spent a couple of months looking weird at every tree I walked by. Story 40. A guy slipped and caught himself. Unfortunately, he caught himself on unstable fryers and brought them down on himself. Third degree burns on 70% of his body. I feel lucky I wasn't there to hear, see, or smell it. Story 41. Worked at Circuit City circa 2005 installing car audio. One of my coworkers put a satellite radio in a brand new BMW, but apparently wired something wrong and the car burned to the ground. Oops. Story 42. I work at a restaurant. There was a guy who worked in the dish pit that was constantly late or calling out of work after a late night claiming to be sick. We all had him on Snapchat. We all knew he wasn't sick most of the time. Fast forward, this kid is actually sick. Like, pale in the face and wobbly on his feet, sick. The managers tell him he has to come into work because he doesn't have a doctor's note. I guess he cried wolf too many times, but man, this was the wrong time to call him on it. He is freaking miserable. It's a busy night, dishes backed up, and he looks like he's about to pass out. The managers tell him to eat something, so he grabs a bowl of soup from the kitchen and wolfs it down. Back to work. Everything else happened in slow motion. He's walking back to the dish pit, grabs a stack of plastic dessert lids and starts to put them away. He collapsed face first onto the floor. Mind you, this kid is over 6 foot tall, and he came crashing to the floor completely unconscious. Everyone freaks out and runs for the manager. We call paramedics. He is sitting in a pool of his own blood. The paramedics come and wheel him out. We start the process of cleaning up the blood, and we have to continue serving tables and doing our jobs in the meantime. It was horrible. The second I saw him on the floor, I got dizzy and left the room. His roommates worked there and had to keep on working while their friend was being carted to the hospital. He ended up having his jaw wired shut for a few weeks because he broke it, and he had to get a few teeth replaced. He was denied workers' comp because he shouldn't have come into work sick, even though the managers threatened him with his job if he didn't come in. Pretty sick, actually. I messaged him a few times to check on him, and he was pretty cool about it, considering the circumstances. He healed up perfectly and found a job elsewhere. Still haunts me to think about all of that blood, though. Story 43. I work at a dog kennel that also offers daycare and grooming. Almost every location has had an incident where a dog passed due to an employee's action. An example of such a case was when a groomer put a muzzle on an English bulldog and he passed from not being able to breathe well enough with the muzzle on. Another time, a groomer accidentally broke a dog's neck. I have no idea how this happened, as it was before I started working there. Maybe not as bad, but the dogs weren't the ones disobeying safety rules here. Poor thing. Story 44. Newer industrial fryers have pumps that allow you to drain/filter the oil. Then, when it is cleaner, a pipe will pump it back up into the fryer basin. Most places I have seen have not upgraded to this. Instead, we would filter oil into a pot, then pick up a massive pot of still extremely hot oil and dump it back into the fryer. I wasn't there for it, but one guy went to Dumo the pot, back into the fryer, fumbled his grip, and poured 300 degrees Fahrenheit oil all over his lower body. Story 45. I work as a front-end cashier at a grocery store. I will not disclose what store. This customer accidentally dropped this huge glass jar of pickles. It smelled so bad. And of course, the smell lingered on the front end for quite a while after it was all cleaned up. I've worked there for a year now, and that's happened 3 times. 3 different customers. Apparently, pickles are a fan favorite to drop. Story 46. Well, it's not 100% workplace, but before work, I showered, and when I bent over to pick up some clothes, I had a sharp pain in my back and had trouble walking. At work, pushed through the pain until we had our usual evening huddle, retail shift meeting. I asked to go home. Ended up having a torn disc in my L4 to L5 space, having a 360 fusion, and will have titanium in my back forever, or story 47. Working at a gravel yard. Front loader operator was loading a pickup truck with 3/4 minus. Imagine parking lot gravel if you don't know. And accidentally pressed the bucket relief. Basically cut the pickup in half, but luckily missed the cab and didn't hit the driver or his wife. Always surprising how brutal heavy equipment is. It's easy to forget when you are around it all the time, but heavy machines will crush a person or a truck with surprising ease. Story 48. I used to work at a mom-and-pop polish restaurant. I received the worst workplace accident there. 2nd-degree burns from steam while cleaning the steamer. I still have a little outline of a scar. Story 49. I work for a laser company. We work with mostly fiber lasers, so the worst I've seen are either A, a guy giving himself a light burn on his finger after focusing the beam at 100% power on his finger to show how little harm the lasers we work with do to skin. Or B, when I gave myself a shallow 1 centimeter cut on a finger, moving a piece of somewhat sharp metal. I'm told that back in the day when the company dealt with CO2 lasers more frequently, that a guy managed to hit a good section of his hand, it instantly cauterized the wound, but he still was missing a hand for like 6 months after that. Story 50. Nothing super special and exciting, but a guy walked into a cooled storage room with a box of dry ice. They found him just in time, unconscious on the floor. There's not huge, colorful warning signs on every single door to warn you. The guy made it, but was immediately let go. For those not in the know, dry ice is CO2 in a solid state. It vaporizes in the cooled room and fills up the air inside with CO2 faster than the AC can handle. You don't notice anything until you faint, pretty much. If you don't get people out of there fast enough, they just pass. Story 51. I work at Home Depot, and I think people forget or don't realize how dangerous that job can actually be. My second day on the job, we had a guy trying to pull down some lumber from the top rack with a forklift to get his fork stuck. When he tried to get unstuck, he gave it too much gas and broke a fork. Pieces of metal went flying, and he got cut pretty much all over his body from tiny pieces of metal. Story 52. Locksmith here. Buddy of mine was unloading a safe from a van on wet pavement on an install job. His legs went out from under him, and the safe dropped straight down and snapped both his femurs like twigs. Story 53. 10 odd years back where I was working, a driver was loading a boom lift onto his tilt tray. It slipped backwards, forcing the basket into the ground and him to be crushed within. That was a bad time. Story 54. Me, broken back in 20s, was told to shove a frame onto a malfunctioning machine. Robot was supposed to do it, but wasn't getting it quite on the track. And the guy that fixes the bots is half a world away. I do what I'm told and feel a pop in my lower back. Then my limbs all go numb. Got real crafty from there on. ER lost my x-rays from that night. employer tried to fire me for being too hurt to work even an office job. Their doctor said it was a muscle sprain and I'd be fine in a few days. Workers' comp had to step in at a state level to make them do anything after I went to my own doctors, and the doc called me in after hours to go over my out-of-pocket MRI because she was sure if I sneezed, I'd be paralyzed. 2 years later, I finally get a WC doc that is willing to do anything. Swears it'll work and I'll be good as new. Surgery goes over by a lot and I'm even worse than before. Duck everything. Don't do crap. You shouldn't just because some duckface tells you to. Story 55. Sad accident. Death. An electrician was working on a giant metal lathe that he had ladoed. This during lunch on the assembly floor. He removed the lodo and fired up the lathe without checking in and around it. An operator was inside of it taking the same opportunity to clean it out. No communication. The operator was ripped to shreds. Interesting accident. An operator laid 120 feet of crane boom across the employee parking lot. Thankfully, it only took out a couple cars. Funny accident. Somebody flipped a Broder's son into our water canal. Expensive accident. Destroying the block of an 880T crane by not engaging both drums for lifting a 400T load. Side-loaded all of the sheaves in the block. Story 56. I work in a factory, and one day the washing machine that cleans the carts we are using stops working. This guy then crawls into the machine, trying to fix it when the doors slam shut and the machine starts. He gets sprayed with almost boiling water and phosphoric acid. He lost all of his skin except on his face, which he covered with his hand. 2 days later, he was taken off life support and he passed away. Also, the week after, an external delivery guy had a heart attack and died in one of the hallways. Story 57. We have these lifts that go as high as 50 feet in the air. One day, some dumbass worker decided to go to the highest it could go to retrieve some cases without a safety harness. Missed a step, fell through the metal beams holding the cases all the way to the ground, resulting in both legs broken. Company didn't pay for anything since he didn't follow safety procedure. Story 58. Worked in a factory with huge machines right out of high school. Ponytails and wearing hair down are a hard no. Woman wore a ponytail one day. Hair got caught in the extremely fast-moving machine. Scalped her. This is a yarn manufacturing company. Story 59. At my work years ago, the whole crew of 5 was electrocuted to death. They were using a boring machine under a road and hit the power lines. No locates back then. Story 60. A small part on the overhead crane called a stop failed and allowed the crane cab to come off the tracks and crash to floor of the factory, hurt the operator, and he passed away. Story 61. When I worked as a lab tech, we had to sterilize our glassware, pipette tips, and plate media in a large autoclave. An autoclave uses pressurized steam to sterilize lab equipment. Anyway, during our safety training, we were told about a lab tech working at a nearby hospital's animal research facility who walked into a walk-in style cage sanitizer and accidentally got locked inside. The sanitizer, for whatever reason, locked and started the cleaning cycle as soon as the door closed. She was only in there for a few seconds before someone heard her screams and turned off the autoclave, but it was too late. She passed away of severe steam burns the next day. Story 62. The building burned down, nobody hurt. The night watch person was dead asleep at their desk until the alarms finally went off, at which point it was too late to save the building. The entire staff spent the next 18 months or so working out of crafty rental trailers in the parking lot while they built a new building. They kept their job. Story 63. I worked at Toys R Us for the last holiday season, and I went to retrieve a radio flyer wagon for a guest when the shelf gave way and completely hit my right leg. I tore multiple muscles and had many sprains and fractures, but I regained most of the functionality of my leg and got compensation because the shelf was a low weight rating. Story 64. At my old job, a person ran over his foot with a pallet jack full of dog food, roughly 6,500 pounds worth. Story 65. Damn, yeah, I worked at a fancy tapas place that did a weekly farmer's market booth where we sold ramen burgers. The buns were fried ramen noodle patties. So our newest host, call her Gina, was sent out to the booth. There was a line cook, host, 2 folding tables, and a hot oil fryer that was placed on the folding table. Well, one lucky night that table collapsed, fryer went flying, and beautiful Gina was covered from the top of her head to her stomach in burning hot cooking oil. Our dumbass line cook made her walk the block back to the restaurant by herself, didn't give her his shirt. Hers is soaked in oil and continuing to burn her skin. From the restaurant, she was put into an ambulance, then flown to a burn unit at another hospital. She received skin grafts all over her face, chest, and back. She wasn't allowed to be in the sun for a year after. I also raised wolves for a nonprofit rescue, and my former boss lost her leg after I resigned. Story 66. Carpentry workshop accident involving a spindle molder. Basically, you have a metal block with shaped cutters used to mold timber. such as skirting boards, spinning at high speed inches from your fingers. An experienced machinist was pushing through some timber when a dead knot broke, snapping the wood. The wood slipped forward, and his hand went into the cutters. He lost 4 fingers, and someone had the lovely job of going into the extractor hopper to fish out what they could, just in case they could be saved. He was taken into the office, and the foreman, who was supposed to be the first aider, took one look and fainted. When the ambulance turned up, the guy who had had the accident walked out to it, while the foreman was taken out on a stretcher. Story 67. Some guy was working in an interstitial space over a large cooler in our warehouse. There is a small space between the unit and the building wall, which he fell into. Since he didn't tell anyone that he was working in there, and he dropped his phone and two-way radio, it was 2 hours before anyone found him. He was only found because someone had good enough hearing to hear him pounding on the wall. Story 68. Not My Work by my mom's work in the 50s. Her spit curl got caught in a huge roller at an envelope factory and ripped her hair and scalp off. She remained conscious all the way to the hospital, had a huge square of skin from her thigh grafted onto her head. After months of recovery, she insisted on going back to work at the same machine. My mom was a badass. Story 69. My first job was at McDonald's. One of my coworkers was working on the fry station and had a bracelet on. Somehow her bracelet came undone and fell into the fryer, and she automatically, without thinking, plunged her arm, elbow deep into the boiling oil to retrieve her bracelet. She didn't get the bracelet, and her arms was as horribly burnt as you'd imagine. Never saw her again. Story 70. I work on a horse ranch. A very dumb guy walked up behind a horse and spooked her. Took a hoof to the face. I watched his face in slow motion. Essentially broke and skinned his entire face. Earned him the name Duckface. He didn't mess around behind horses after that. Story 71. My dad was witness to a pretty gruesome one 25 years ago at a dry cleaners he used to work for that involved one of those heated clothes press things. They look a bit like a giant flat George Foreman grill. The machine in question had been faulty for months. Basically, the latch that'd stop it randomly coming down and closing was broken, along with the emergency release button too, but the owners of the company were tight-arises and never paid for it to be fixed. One day, a woman was working on it when it suddenly closed down right on her hand and locked down on it. My dad was the only one there and heard her agonizing screams begging for help. He said the sound of her hand cooking in this press sounded like a steak put on a frying pan with all the sizzling. My dad couldn't undo the latch because her hand had basically jammed the lock on it. And of course, the emergency release button was ducked too, so that wasn't an option. In the end, he used a pole to smash the latch so he could open it. Her hand was trapped for about 30 seconds or so. When he managed to open it, he said, her skin stretched like grilled cheese. Luckily for her, she'd passed out from the pain, but the damage was done. Her hand had irreparable damage done to it. It gets worse though. The owners suggested to my dad that he should pay for the machine's latch to be fixed as he broke it. My dad straight up refused. The woman then sued the dry cleaning company, and the owners asked my dad not to be a witness for her. They even said, "Can you believe she's actually seeing us after all we've done for her?" Which made my dad incredibly angry. He quit that job and stood as a witness for her at court. She got a massive payout, but will only have something like 30% use of her hand for the rest of her life. Story 72. Worked for Parks Division for my town. We would pick garbage in the parks or use weed eaters in the ditches. One day our crew was using weed eaters, and we had one older lady on our crew. She wasn't paying attention when a semi pulled away from a card lock. His trailer swung into the ditch and ran her over. He was probably only doing 5 kilometers per hour. I was the one who discovered her body. I'm sure it was painful. I was 18 at the time. I will never forget that image. I'm a business owner now. Safety is number one for every job, and I do all the most dangerous things instead of my staff. Story 73. We had an intern passed away in a vehicle accident last summer because he dropped his phone, then reached down to pick it up. Then he crossed several lanes of traffic and ended up going the wrong way down the interstate. Head-on crash with an 18-wheeler, and that's why interns aren't allowed to drive here anymore. Story 74. A manager using a forklift bumped one of the emergency water pipes, totally flooded the warehouse and part of the sales floor. It led to the entire shopping center being temporarily closed/evacuated. Not sure exactly why, but I think it had something to do with the fire alarm system. We had the store cleaned up in a few hours and were open the rest of the day. Our crew was efficient. It was a hardware store, and we managed to scoop up most of the products on the floor and move them to the upper shelves before they got wet. Story 75. No, not workplace, but school accident. Guy was coming out of the bathroom. The door opens towards the corridor and accidentally stabs a kid running down the corridor with the door handle. Story 76. Wasn't in the shop at the time, but saw something was happening as half the floor was running towards something. New hire wasn't paying attention near the welding area. Either grease or lubricant or some substance was left on part of the piece she had in front of her. The thing all but exploded in her face, and her welding mask was on, but wasn't down. She had second-degree burns across her face from her hairline to her chin like a perfect mask. She survived but was in the hospital for a few months and didn't return to work for over a year. Story 77. I have two different accounts of considered worst workplace accidents, both from different jobs I had. First was when I worked at Subway. An older woman, we'll call D, who worked morning shifts, had to make a new batch of cookies every morning after the bread. The oven was highly elevated up too. Get a better idea, I stand at 5 feet 6 inches and my face goes up enough to at least see the floor of the oven. D, however, was much shorter than I am. She couldn't see the floor of the oven, so one day she's rushing with customers and the cookies finished. Well, what ended up happening was, in her rush, the sheet pan slipped out of her hand and dumped 250-degree plus cookies onto her neck and chest. It resulted in some very serious burns that required her to get to the hospital for treatment. Nothing permanent came from the injury, and she's just fine now. This second one's specificity happened to me sometime last year. I now work at a gas station as a food prep. Besides 2 minor burns from cooking donuts and cookies, nothing serious ever really happened to me up to the point. We were short-staffed because a few people quit or were fired, so a guy from another location came in to do the graveyard shift. The lazy ass did absolutely nothing but ring up costumers and do minor cleaning and left the back prep area a complete mess. Cardboard boxes covered the floor and a broom was laying on the path that I'd take donuts out of. I was running late because the guy didn't bring the day-old donuts in the back and also didn't turn on the oven, so I was 15 minutes behind schedule. Now, this is also my mistake. I did kick the boxes out of the way, but I forgot to pick up the broom. The first tray of donuts I bring out, I walk over it just fine, but I ducked up the second time. I ended up stepping on the broom handle and slipped. In the few brief seconds, I managed to lunge myself forward, slamming down onto my knees, saving the donuts from falling off the sheet pan and my head from cracking open on the tiled concrete flooring. Before shock can even wear off metal shelving that was previously resting against a corner disassembled, decided to fall forward and hit the majority of my back and a portion of my head. I spent 5 minutes on the ground holding this tray in my arms, stunned and thinking, thank the donuts are okay. I got up, fixed them up, and put them out, then went to my coworkers, who apparently didn't hear me because of the constantly loud music playing up front. I ended up with some pretty bad bruises. My left knee the worse. By the end of week 1/2 of the healing stage, the bruise was purple and green, along with the fact I'd feel a popping sensation every time I walked. I'm, however, stupidly stubborn. I thought I'd be fine, and technically I am, but occasionally my left knee will have a popping sensation, but coming up onto 2 years and a few months, and no major incidents since. Story 78. Not current job, but I worked at a warehouse about 4 years ago in Florida that had a crafty forklift. The tilt cylinder was pissing hydraulic fluid like a mafka. The operations manager wanted to wait till the end of the fiscal year to get a new one. The cheap bastard. We had to call mechanics out to top it off and limp it along as we can. Every 10 days like clockwork. Tried explaining to the op manager that no problem ever got better by ignoring it. The fluid was leaking all over the warehouse floor and made it slippery as crap. The parking lot looked like a crafty Jackson Pollock painting anytime we had to take it out to unload anything. One day, an operator was having to get a pallet of something down from about 6 to 7 feet above the floor. Another associate was standing about 10 feet in front of the forklift. When the tilt cylinder breaks in half, somebody yells out to the guy, and he moves out of the way just fast enough to avoid the pallet slipping of the forks and onto his head. It does hit everything on the right side of his neck. Dislocates his shoulder, breaking his collarbone in 2 places, fracturing a couple ribs, his hip and shin. The operations manager refused to file the guy's workers' comp claim, fired him, and the forklift was gone the next morning. Dude sued the company, but settled out of court for whatever reason. Story 79. Not me, but this happened a few weeks ago where my brother-in-law works, and he told me about it. So my brother-in-law works for a plant that markets transportation fuel and asphalt. They had to do some job where teams of 2 would go down into a huge tank wearing oxygen tanks. The tanks held gases that made it impossible to breathe. Do whatever they had to do until their oxygen started running low. They would be pulled back up, and another team would go in right after. And so my BIL goes with his buddy down into the tank, they do their thing, then they come back up. The next team goes in right away. One of the guys on the second team apparently had some sort of leak in his oxygen supply and didn't know it until he was down in the tank. His oxygen supply was dropping faster than it should have been, so the guy started freaking out, which caused him to use up his oxygen even faster. His partner was trying to calm him down so that he could have enough oxygen to breathe while he was being pulled back up out of the tank. All of his oxygen ran out, and my BIL saw him get pulled out of the tank. BIL said that he was blue and limp. He was in his late 20s, had a wife, had a young daughter. It was pretty sad. Story 80. Current job had a big dryer explode, blew off the roof of the building. Dust in the 90s. But I was a kid then. If we go with jobs and events I was present for, I would have to go with a guy whole, went through a door/wall, with their forks too high, ripped out a potable line and a fire line, as well as a bunch of electrical line. For me personally, I was working in a warehouse a few years back, and one of our older experienced workers were leaving to go back to college. It was their last day, and our supervisor asked if there was anything they always wanted to do. So he asked if we could shrink wrap me and a high school-age coworker back to back and then wheel us through the office section of our building. So there we were, getting wrapped top to bottom, with two guys helping hold us steady. Wrap was finished. The guy leaving, who wrapped us, went to rip the wrap, and instead basically yanked our legs out from under us. The spotters did a crap job, and I smashed my face into the concrete without the ability to move my arms or legs, or really brace in any way. Not to mention the nearly 200 pounds strapped to my back for maximum fun for my face. Did not lose teeth or break bones by some small miracle. Story 81. I have seen a ton of crap in the chemical industry, but the best/goriest has to be a man being sprayed with 95% sulfuric acid, no PPE. He went to hook a line from a 500-gallon tank to an empty tank, and the connection wasn't snug. He opened the valve and it sprayed hard right onto his face and upper chest. He didn't die, but he is laid off forever/early retirement/disfigured. I saw another man have his arm ripped off his chest, a close call/near miss of a large electric engine, falling off a lift, landing on a man, or so I thought, but it got wedged above his head and just gave him a light bonk. Story 82. Not security, but we walked into work one day at World Market to notice that all the upstock boxes were knocked to the ground all over the store. Not just in one area, every box in every department. No earthquake, no alarm triggered. We watched the video footage, and you just see boxes start falling in the bathroom section, then the kitchen department, then the exotic food section. It scared 2 employees badly enough that one quit that day, and one put in her resignation later that week after feeling creeped out in the warehouse. The property manager accounted it to animals or rodents getting in at night, but that video is ingrained in my head. Story 83. Person decided to climb up a ladder to get on top of a fermentation vessel during heavy snow. Climbed up the ladder, okay, but then slipped on the ice, resulting in them breaking both their elbows at the same time, on the steel railings on the guide path on the vessel, and then falling off said vessel onto the hard concrete floor below and fracturing their pelvis. I worked on the UK site, and this occurred on the US site. Another one was a bioreactor exploded during cleaning, resulting in the death of 4 people. Story 84. We were learning to make cold soup at a fancy restaurant. Each trainee chef had to follow the same recipe and produce the right color, texture, and flavor. Each chef also had a blender and had finished off their soup to the right consistency. One of the ladies got something stuck in the blades of her blender, so she turned it off and stuck her hand in to dislodge the offending item. Unfortunately, her rather ample breasts hit the pulse button, and she lost 3 of her fingers. Her soup did not pass. Story 85. I used to work on commercial fishing vessels. One guy's life jacket straps got caught on some spinning mechanism in the engine room. His arm got pulled in and smashed to pieces. He had to use a penknife to cut his arm out of the mechanism, and then he plugged the artery with a golf ball he had in his pocket. We were told this in our health and safety training in our first week as an example of what could go wrong. The guy had to have his arm amputated and now has a prosthetic and an office job. Story 86. I no longer work there, but once bad, a close friend gets severe 3rd-degree burns from his waist to knees from getting splashed with anhydrous ammonia. I still remember the phone call at about 1 a.m. from the hospital of him, out of his mind on morphine, freaking out that he won't be able to use his weenie to please his wife anymore. Story 87. At the satellite factory, one guy managed to bake himself in the satellite-sized thermal cycler. That is, the one for cycling the whole ducking thing. I'm pretty sure that took a lot of effort. Also, cleaning the chamber took ages now that it had a layer of equals grease all over the inside of it. Story 88. Work in a daycare. And I stepped on a Lego, fell backwards, and cracked my ankle and ass, and almost landed on an infant. I didn't see that they had scattered a few pieces outside the okay area, and bam, almost died, but the babies thought it was funny. Story 89. Work colleague in a warehouse a few years ago climbed up the racking where pallets of goods were stored to reach something. Was only about 4 feet up, but he jumped down and caught his wedding ring on the metal shelving and slid his finger straight off. Story 90. According to my father-in-law, they used to keep a photo of an accident from the 60s on the office wall. Some poor idiot ignored the rules and got squeezed between 2 trailers. His name was Michael, and the local safety award was named for him. They took it down in the 90s, but what with it being a smoking workplace for years, I could still see the void on the wall when I started there in the naughtiest. Story 91. I'm a financial consultant. On one project I worked on, the guy before me had crossed the border into Iraq. He was kidnapped and held prisoner for over 2 years. His wife never missed a trick and billed for every day he was in captivity. Story 92. I don't recall any fatality by accident, but a few years ago, I do IT at a lactic acid plant. We had someone lock themselves into the nitrous oxide storage and opening the tap. At least it was painless. Story 93. I used to work in quality control at a circuit board manufacturer. This is a story that my boss told me when I first started. My boss had an office on the very southwestern corner of the building, which is located about as far away from the loading room as one can get. You can't hear crap from the machines until you're at the lunchroom, which is about halfway between the two rooms. Machines are loud, very loud. This is relevant later. A worker was using a CNC machine to route some circuit boards and coupons, basically sample bits of board for testing purposes, out from their panel. The machine is loaded up with a program, and it finds landmarks on the board to figure out the placement, and then begins to automatically cut/route the board. The machine was very old, and it would often shut off by itself every 10 minutes or so. So the department fixed it by disabling the emergency shutoff, which was somehow causing the problem. In hindsight, there was probably something horribly wrong with it. A board got knocked out of place while a program was running. Instead of stopping the machine and rerunning or scrapping the job per work instructions, the guy figured he could nudge it back into place all quick-like. You can probably guess how this goes. My boss said that he could hear the man's screams all the way from just outside his office. He didn't see the incident, only the aftermath. One of the other workers in the department called emergency services. I hear the guy got a hefty workers' comp payout, and he didn't come back due to the mangled hand. The company got new routing machines shortly after the incident and made it a point to replace broken things ASAP, even if there was no possible way it could be fatal. Story 94. When I worked in the oil field as a safety guy, I got called to a vehicle collision. Some guy driving a little sedan swerved out of his lane on a 2-lane highway and hit the front corner of a F350 with a big-ass steel brush guard. At probably 60 miles per hour, it peeled open the sedan like a sardine can. The rest of the body was thrown out of the car and into the road. The whole thing was something you'd see in an over-the-top gore movie scene, almost unreal, but absolutely disgusting. Our driver was fine, but understandably shaken and was given 2 weeks of paid leave to regroup. We later found out the sedan was stolen and the driver was a wanted felon. Also had a guy when I was deployed end his life with his M4. Some people found him in the barracks when he never reported for duty. He left a note saying he found out his wife had been cheating on him, cleaned out their accounts, and was taking their kids and leaving. Story 95. A carpenter I used to work with was holding a roof beam steady for the owner of the company, who was using a nail gun to nail a 2x4 to the top of the beam. Carpenter told the boss, "Be careful, that gun likes to jump and double shoot." Boss goes, Yeah, I know what I'm doing," and proceeds to nail this dude to the beam, framing nail right through the finger. So now he's got to hold the beam steady, on a ladder, while getting out a chisel to cut enough of the beam away so the nail could be pulled out. Back to work the next day, with a ducking band-aid wrapped around his finger. Ducking hated that job. Story 96. Worked on airplanes in the Navy. We're going to move a plane out of the hangar, and the girl putting up the ladder almost lost her whole thumb. The worst part is that when the ambulance got there, they said they couldn't take her because she won't lose the thumb if we don't, so it was not deemed an emergency. I found someone to take her, but the powers that be, chiefs in maintenance control, decided to wait until the command doctor showed up to work 2 hours later. And it was learned that if she had shown up at the hospital 20 minutes later than she had, she would have lost her thumb. Story 97. A customer falling down the stairs in our cinema. Guy was barely alive. Warned him a gazillion times about those stairs because he was spastic and had little control over his movement. Of course, he was butt naked. Ambulance people covered him up. Blood came from his ears and nose. He was in an artificial coma for 6 weeks. Had to learn everything again. Also phoned us whether he was still welcome. No, we know he took substances that night, and this incident costs us customers. Story 98. Biggest accident wasn't a death, but I saw the aftermath. A guy had an e-stop defeated, actually an accepted procedure at the time for a specific maintenance function, but the line was moving, causing the machine he was half inside to engage. A bar move, pushing his elbow towards his wrist. Both forearm bones snapped in two. I walked in about half an hour later. Story 99. I work for a bearing plant. We have parts that slide onto a metal container. If it jams, you must cut off the power. If you don't, it's going to keep pushing, like it's programmed to. A girl decided to push a piece. She was stuck in the machine 30 minutes before anyone found her. Maintenance and paramedics tried to pull it apart for close to an hour. Her arm almost got lost. She was in shock. Story 100. I work in aviation. We had 2 plane crashes last year. Amazingly, the pilots survived in both crashes. One was pretty badly injured, but he is recovered and back at work now. Apparently, it's pretty amazing that he survived, but he did everything right when his engine died and someone was able to locate him quickly. I think "Our pilot survived a plane crash" would be an excellent slogan. Story 101. I don't work, but, school is kind of similar to a job, right? So I take a lot of construction/technology classes. In one of them, we use a lot of power tools to do whatever we need to do. There's this kid in my class who is just an actual dumbass. For some reason, he was around while using a disc sander. Long story short, he no longer has the end joint on his right thumb. Story 102. Magnetic overhead crane attachment failed. Dropped a 20-foot-long 2-inch metal plate on top of a guy. Both his sons were working that day. Also had a guy that was maneuvering a coil with overhead crane reach under to place a block under it. When he bent over his stomach, pressed a button. Guy next to him said he heard something like a peanut being crushed. Story 103. 1.5-ton paper roll fell off and crushed a guy. They were loading the paper roll into a printing press, newspaper. After that, it became automated via equipment, etc., with a human just pushing button. I was not there at the time and do not work there anymore. Story 104. Had a maintenance worker get hit with basically a fire hose volume of fairly concentrated HF acid. Didn't kill him instantly, but it's a death sentence and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. Story 105. Guy forgot to tie off his safety harness, bonked his head, and fell 4 stories and died on impact. That morning, he was telling everyone how excited he was for his family reunion that weekend. Story 106. Building 1. To enter, you need to walk between 2 boxes. Passage itself is blocked by 2 plexiglass slides. Once you put your card on reader, they slide aside into boxes and you walk in. Employee decided to bring her kid and they walk in together. Slides slide back in before they clear it, hurt her fingers. Building 2. Employee walks down the stairs, trips on carpet, and falls headfirst forward. Automatic doors there don't open quickly enough. Slams his head on them. Luckily, they don't break, but he hits them with enough force that there is blood. Story 107. I got a mild concussion from a 10 pounds random piece of metal that fell on my head. I work at a bank. We have to check the ATM every day. Ours is located outside in a separate small building at the edge of our drive-thru. The building itself is big enough to house the ATM, night drop box, and maybe a 3 feet by 3 feet space for 2 people to stand in. And yes, we need 2 people because everything we do related to money at a bank is under dual control. On this particular morning, my coworker and I, let's call him Frank, enter the ATM, him first and me second. He is at the computer getting the info, and I close the door, turn around and take a step to move toward the opposite corner of my coworker when I feel something large and heavy bounce off my head and then hit the floor. I fall backward, hitting the door, and would have fallen over had the door not been there, or had the space been any bigger. I grab my head and immediately start to tear up. Frank hears the metal clank on the floor and me almost fall over. He asks me if I'm all right. I don't even know what happened, let alone how I am. So he suggests we head back inside. I'm holding my head, worried that blood could be gushing everywhere, and completely discombobulated. We get inside and describe what happened. My head gets looked at by another coworker. Luckily, I'm not bleeding. I have a nice sized bump growing on top of my head and my headache is just intense. Some other coworkers went out to finish the ATM and found an oddly shaped piece of metal. No one has any idea what it was for or what it was doing on a wobbly shelf above the door of the ATM. I take some aspirin and sit in the break room for about 30-40 minutes until my head feels somewhat normal. I was told I could leave for the day, but I was worried about hours, typical dystopian American healthcare for you, and that they would make me drop for a visit to the doctor or emergency room. Cannabis to help with my anxiety, so not clean. I stayed the rest of the day, even when the regional manager stopped in to check on it. I ended up with a mild concussion because of that. My words, numbers, and sometimes letters were messed up for months. Because of that, the bank had an extra safety meeting, and now every branch has a first aid kit and one person that is first aid and CPR trained, which also happens to be me. Story 108. A guy hit by a machine. I was the shift lead man at the time. I managed employee assignment. There was also a supervisor on the shift, but he was gone at the time and it happened in a vacuum forming machine. This is a huge machine used to form plastic. A sheet of plastic gets heated up in an oven. The mold to shape the plastic is in 2 parts. The warm plastic gets moved to the mold, then the 2 halves get pushed together to shape the plastic. The worker was getting trained on how to set up the machines, so there were 2 guys in this station instead of the usual one. He was working on the mold, and the person training him was at the control panel. Somehow the machine starts to run. The 2 halves of the mold come together, and he is between them. The guy training him paged me down to the machine. I would get called to a workstation dozens of times a day, so I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. I get down there, and I knew right away he wasn't going to make it. I called for help and tried to get the entire crew back to work. Instead of an ambulance, a helicopter was sent to get him. They got him loaded up and was on the way to a hospital. He passed pretty quickly. The worst part of this accident was the guy survived a tour in Vietnam, but not a simple factory job. Story 109. I worked at Golden Corral. Don't ever work there. Sundays were the busiest days, due to the church crowd coming to fill their bellies with absolute garbage for hours on end. We were running low on plates, so I went to the back to fetch some plates. See, there's this huge rack where they stack all the trays for the food. One of the dishwashers stacked these trays to high. Mind you, these edges are sharp as duck. They put the plates near the rack where the trays were. Now, as I said, the trays were stacked too high, so I hear a "look out!" and I looked up to see a tray edge first coming for me. Before I could move, the tray landed right on my forehead, causing a huge cut to get from mid-forehead to almost past my eyebrow. I didn't feel any pain at first, so I just said, "I am okay." I went to the sink, which is behind the cash register where all the people could see you. I turned around and an elderly woman screamed so loud, scaring the crap out of me. I said, "What?" My coworker said, "You are bleeding." And I said, "Oh?" I put my finger barely on my face and blood is going down my entire face, dripping onto my white uniform. My boss still made me finish my entire shift, regardless of me having a pretty nasty migraine afterwards. Story 110. Not at my work, but at a friend's when I was in high school. He, Jay, and one of his friends, S, who I didn't really know too well, we were in the same woodshop class, but that's it, worked together at a popular pizza chain. They used to get the flat-packed pizza boxes delivered in plastic wrap, in pallets about 3 boxes wide, 3 deep, and like 5 feet tall. S, Jay, and another girl were the only ones working at the time this happened. The girl was on register duty, Jay was making the pizzas, and S was in the back room unpacking the new stuff. He had a utility knife that he was holding in his fist, slicing the wrap on the boxes from top to bottom. Basically, imagine if your arms are down and you're making a fist. The blade is pointed backwards behind you. He must have slipped while he was slicing the wrap, pulled too far. It was only a small blade, but it got him in the femoral artery. He collapsed and bled to death before he could get out of the storage room. Nobody even realized until his shift was over and he hadn't clocked out. I remember our woodshop class was canceled the next day, and despite being halfway through the semester, we had to relearn how to hold chisels, saws, blades, and things like that. Story 111. Not mine, but my mom's story. She had been on her break at her job as a carer for the elderly in a home, which isn't really a break since they always need to answer buzzers anyway, when she was on the property outside at midnight when she fell into a sewage drain. She had been dangling in human waste and excrements and had hit her right thigh on the right side pretty badly, bruised and swollen from the very rusty broken metal that was supposed to cover the hole. She immediately got herself out and just went inside to state she's going to A&E since she could barely walk. She actually came home and showered though first, since she didn't want it infected. Then went to A&E. I know she shouldn't be driving, but that was the only option at the time. She had a tetanus jab and got it disinfected, but she still can't go into work due to it. One of her coworkers saw her in a shop and probably told on her, but she still needs to feed herself and her mom, so she had to go even though she can't walk without limping. The company's only paying her sick leave because they don't want her going higher in the legal department, even though she gave proof from doctors in the hospital. Story 112. Maybe not as bad, but I work in the office attached to a steelwork fabrication shop. New guy came in. He has experience, is a fabricator, should know the ins and outs of safety. We show him how to use our cranes, to be sure. Literally, third lift he makes with the crane. 2 huge I-beams side by side, wraps the chains around them, starts lifting, and the chains slam the flanges of the 2 beams together. You can guess where his fingers were, I bet. Yep, lost all 4 fingers. You know it's bad when leather gloves start bleeding again. We never saw him again after that, but I did hear after surgery and some plates he was okay, and lucky to at least still have 5 fingers. Story 113. I work in fast food, and although this didn't occur at my store, it happened relatively close by. We have pressure cookers that we cook fried chicken in, and we have to clean these daily. Cleaning them can be a pain in the ass, so you have to use hot water to get off any of the hard oil buildup on the sides. You're meant to completely dry them of water before filling them back up with oil. Some dumbass left a fair bit of water in their cooker before filling it back up with oil. They turned on the cooker to begin heating the oil, which it did. However, oil sits on top of water, and water boils at 100 degrees. These cookers heat oil up to 180 degrees, both Celsius, so that means it's ducking hot. This water's sitting at the bottom underneath all this oil, superheated because of the temperature, causing the liquid to rise up and splash out all over the employee. He got third-degree burns all over his body. We now have a water detection addition to the cooker. It won't heat up if it detects water. Story 114. On my first day working for a frozen food distribution company, we were training to use those dumbass motorized pallet jacks where you ride on the back. It was my turn to take my first spin on the thing. I went around a corner, got kind of stuck under some scaffolding. I went to step off of the thing and I guess I hadn't released the throttle enough. It lurched forward and caught my foot between the pallet jack and the metal scaffolding that the products are stored on. I was fortunately able to free myself rather quickly. The guys training us took a look at my now rapidly swelling and discolored foot, saying, "I think it's just bruised." I knew it was broken, and it was, in 4 places. Luckily, the fractures were perfect and required no setting or even a cast. I also learned when something on your body swells up really, really fast, a blister can form. Mine was about the size of a large strawberry and left quite a deep scar. Story 115. A few years back, I worked at a lumber mill. We had a machine that would stripe the bark off of small wood posts that we would use to make fence posts. Foreman thought it would be a good idea to have the new guy, just became a minor league player in my city, apparently he was a promising pitcher, run the machine. Some of the posts have notches that would get stuck on the roller before they could reach the blades. And when that happens, you are to use a 4-foot rod to keep feeding the post through. We even had a sign telling you to never use your hands to feed it through. So what does he do? Uses his hand to push a stuck post through the machine, loses his footing, and gets his wrist hit by the blades. The moron walked the post to the blades rather than keeping a safe distance. Luckily, we got the bleeding under control for him to get to the hospital. We find out later the team dropped him and haven't seen him since he left for He Hospital. Story 116. I was on work experience as a 15-year-old in a warehousing facility that belonged to a UK-based catalog in a store national chain. I quickly discovered I was the only one that could work the CCTV, and the shop floor guys quickly started with, "I'll give you a quid if you can catch colleague doing any work today," and similar. One morning, there was an impromptu meeting in one of the aisles, and both the guy on the motorized stand-on pallet lift and the forklift turned up. Everyone spent 5 minutes chatting, then went off to work. The guy in the forklift waited until everyone around him had cleared so he could reverse 180 degrees and carry on. He was so busy watching all the pedestrians, he didn't check for the guy stood on the back of the loaded pallet truck. When he came around 180 degrees, he hit the back of the pallet truck and crushed the driver's foot fully between the two vehicles. I had to play that CCTV back 30 to 40 times. Story 117. Our work had morning shift and afternoon shift. Afternoon shift was full of morons. They borrowed tools from lines and never gave them back. Most of the time, we'd have to demolish and rework their products. You get the idea. About 30 minutes after my shift ended, I'm sitting at the bus stop and an ambulance flashes past. Lights, sirens, pulls right into my work. Some idiot had claimed to have the required safety paperwork to use the bandsaw. He lost 3 fingers. Worst ones that happened on my shift were the guy who squatted with his feet on the toilet seat and the bowl just cracked open under him. He got a few stitches to the back of his legs. My supervisor got electrocuted by faulty products. The time someone tripped over and hit their shin open on a pallet. Or the time a forklift driver forgot that he couldn't put the small pallets on the top shelves and almost brought down all the shelving stacks. Story 118. Opposite version of these stories. I worked at a movie theater for like a decade in my 20s. I was friends with all the local police and firemen because they came by a lot and we let them and their families in for free. One day at work, I fell down a flight of 4 stairs and twisted my leg. It was not at all a big deal, but for liability reasons, they had to call emergency services and have my leg checked out before I continued my day. In the city we were in, a call for emergency services necessitated a call to fire, ambulance, and police, and that one of each show up. So all these guys I knew came in to find me with a lightly twisted leg. I have never had my balls busted so hard in my life. One of the guys kept yelling, "Cleat the corridor! We got a casualty!" and crap like that. I survived and even managed to finish out my shift after an endless roast. Story 119. I worked as a summer rec counselor, and one of the kids went missing for an hour. The kid's mom had come to pick him up. He was nowhere to be found. The group we had were K2, so we thought he had been kidnapped from the park. After 50 minutes of searching, one of the other parents heard a kid talking inside a locked closet. One of the guys opened the closet, and we found the missing kid. When asked why he went in there, he said, "The man told me to." There was a man-sized hole in the wall we found after the kid explained what he meant. There was a ducking guy living under the stage. The hole in the closet apparently leads under the stage. This obviously could pick locks since it locks from the outside. The door has keyhole on the inside. We don't know what the man's intention was. He was arrested for trespassing and other things. Story 120. Not mine, but my father's story. Don't really remember all the details since it happened about 1 to 3 years ago. He had some guy working in the steel mill, and I think he was standing under one of the crucibles. I don't know what happened in between that, but the molten steel poured all over his entire body. I don't remember if he died on the spot or he died in the hospital. I feel bad for the man. I think he had a wife and a son when he passed. Gotta be one of the most horrible ways to go since it sounds similar to falling in lava. But the thing is, it's on you and you can't get it off. So you're suffering with a molten hot, sticky fluid that you can't get off. Story 121. This happened about 15 to 20 years ago when health and safety wasn't what it is today. So I work in a hot rolling mill and accidents are bound to happen, but occasionally they go very badly. Excluding a couple of deaths, I'd heard rumor of the worst one I know of. There was a guy who had been working on the tongs passing hot billets between housings when One got stuck in the chute, so he stood astride over the billet and pulled it between his legs to free it. However, it bounced off of the floor, and as he fell back, it came back up and went about 6 inches into his taint. These billets were about 40 millimeters in diameter, so it did some serious damage. The guy is fine now, but he has to have a colostomy bag due to the damage it did. He had quite the payout, too. Story 122. I work in an operating room, and our perfusion team runs an instrument called a cell saver. Blood is sucked up, spun, and the good cells separated and returned to the body. The anesthesia team administers the blood. The clamp was closed to allow the good blood to flow to the bag. The tubing could only take so much pressure and popped. It sprayed blood everywhere. Anesthesia nor perfusion were wearing eye protection. The patient had to be tested and came back positive for Hep C and HIV. I felt really badly for the CRNA student because the hospital only covers the first part of your antivirals. The rest is on the student's dime, which is ducked up. We were all pretty down until we learned it was a false positive and everyone was safe. Story 123. So me and my coworker were moving empty grain rail cars into the yard so the rail company could do their switch and bring us full cars. He decided to ride one of the cars, and I was driving the track mobile. He somehow managed to get to the side of the car and wasn't paying attention to where he was standing. The top of a ladder that's on our loading dock stabbed him in his upper thigh, which caused him to fall off the rail car. But his feet were hung up on the back of the car still. He got substances about 100 feet by the train until the loading dock ended. Thank God I didn't hurt my coworker. Git got a broken collarbone, a good bit of stitches, and is apparently getting a big settlement from lack of proper training. Story 124. Not at work, but this happened at uni. I was out that day, but students were in one of the workshop areas. In the woodwork area, they had a saw machine where the blade ran up and down extremely fast. There are dozens of safety warnings and emergency stop button. When the student finished sawing a piece of wood, they turned the machine off, but the saw was still going fast as it takes a small amount of time to slow down and stop. The student decided to sweep the sawdust around the moving blade off the table. In doing so, she caught her finger on the blade and lost it. They called an ambulance, and I think they were able to reattach it in the end. Story 125. I'm a truck driver, and a little over a year ago, there was a mechanic's helper who got hit while filling a truck tire up with air. We don't know if he got careless and wasn't paying attention, or if there was some unseen damage to the tire. But the tire, which packs about 110 pounds per square inch at maximum, blew up. He was standing about 2 feet away from the tire when it had exploded, and the force knocked him several feet back into a concrete wall. That combined with the steel mesh from the inner tire and rubber flying around, it was pretty bad. He was pronounced dead on the scene. Story 126. Not really at my work. I don't work, I'm still a student, but my dad is a pretty successful businessman, and like 6 years ago, he built his own factory, and one of the first steps in building the factory was hammering steel pillars into the ground with a giant hammer on some kind of crane. I don't really know how to explain it. Well, the foreman got his foot between one of the steel pillars. Story 127. Just recently had a guy in a trench with some kind of handheld saw. Instead of flipping on the safety and powering down the saw, this genius just unplugs it while it's still running and leaves the blade exposed. Fast forward 30 minutes, he gets back into the trench and stands with his leg against the blade. Apparently he forgot he had left it running when he unplugged it because he plugged it back in, and of course it turns on and cuts a nice deep gouge into his leg. Cue ambulance, workers' comp, and angry boss the rest of the day. Story 128. Not workplace, but playing high school football, there were some pretty terrible injuries. Top 3 were 1. A kid got butt by a piece of metal and lost like a pint of blood on the field too. During practice, a kid got hit so hard that you could hear the bones in his leg break from across the field. 3. A friend of mine was running the ball and squared up and went shoulder to this kid's helmet. He hit the ground head first, and his helmet made a loud popping sound. Later found out he had a serious concussion and had no idea what had happened. Story 129. Didn't happen at my plant, but at another location. During scheduled maintenance, a man was working on changing a sight glass in a large bodied evaporator. Apparently the body was under an immense amount of vacuum, and when he went to remove the sight glass, routine maintenance work, his arm was pulled through by the vacuum force. His organs were all shifted due to the immense force, and he died soon after. It was sad for everyone employed by our company, but it ended up changing a lot of safety measures company-wide. Story 130. Some ducking idiot at the McDonald's I used to work at burned the hell out of his chest by flipping the fry grease onto himself. I still, to this day, about 2 years later, don't know how in the duck he did that. Anyways, he tried to sue, but the cameras clearly showed him flipping the grease on himself in a way that could have been avoided, so he couldn't sue. It's like maybe he did it on purpose, but at the same time, it was a totally accident. the way it was tossed on him. It was funny though for a second. Story 131. I've seen someone readjust an industrial conveyor with his hands, only for his middle finger to get caught by one of the cogs. He lost finger. When he came back from the hospital, he looked fine, but they give him with lots of medics. Later, he told us that he had severe pain months after story 132. Used to work at a tire place. We did heavy machinery too. One day, a guy mounting a big-ass tractor tire decides to stick his head in between the rim and tire to see why it's not behaving properly. Tire falls and he almost broke his neck as it was squeezed between rim and tire. Tire must have weighed like 250 kilograms, 500-something pounds. This guy was overall totally oblivious to what was going on around him and was just clueless about everything. He was let go shortly after the accident. Story 133. I'm a florist. You wouldn't think anything bad can happen at a florist. But this guy that worked for us briefly straight up stabbed himself while cutting flowers. There's a specific way you hit flowers, where you're actually pulling the flower away from you, not the knife towards you. He was cutting a thick hydrangea stem, and he pulled the knife towards him. Luckily, he's a heavier dude, so it didn't actually do any serious harm. He just needed stitches. Story 134. I worked for a day at a meat/pie/and poultry stall at the local market. This day, someone lost their finger. In short, the meat slicer needed to be cleaned, and that was my day. I put a sign up saying the machine was being cleaned, but the boss lady thought, no, she thought she could slice some bacon. In other words, she cut one slice, her hand slipped. We had to get ice from the next stall as someone called an ambulance. Story 135. Years back while in the Navy Yards in Bremerton, Washington, I was looking across the water to the next pier over. A ship had a hole opened on her starboard side and a flat barge tied up to it. Yard workers were maneuvering a forklift on the barge to bring some heavy machinery out of the hull, but had not taken into consideration the combined weights of forklift and machinery. Barge pulled away from the ship, and the forklift dropped into the water, carrying the FL operator to his death. Story 136. I worked at a department store for tile. A man got crushed by a forklift after it flipped on him. He was attempting to move too much weight, and it tipped forward. At the same time, he fell out. When the pallets fell of the forks, the forklift went upright again, crushing him. It happened just a few minutes before I went to the back. I still get upset about the management's lack of safety protocol enforcement and understaffing that, in my opinion, led to this fatal accident. Rip B. Story 137. Not at my current job, but one a few years ago, we had a guy that had been working there, maybe out 2 months, and he came in blatantly high every single day. On what? I don't know. He was frying before the lunch rush hot, and he dropped his tongs he was using into the fried. And without thinking about it, reached in and grabbed them. Took him about 10 seconds for his body to register the pain, but once it did, he wouldn't stop screaming, which is when the rest have realized his duck up. Story 138. Not quite in the same vein, but a data center technician at my work accidentally unplugged enough drives in a live SAN to exceed the failure tolerance and wipe out the entire IT system of a government department. Somehow the fault was progressive and got backed up to the disaster recovery/high availability environment, so everything was lost. Took the better part of 3 months to recover, but we fixed it all up well, and good enough that the contract got renewed. Story 139. National Guard. Out in the field in 1990 or 91. One guy's trying to guide a driver, trying to maneuver his deuce out of a tight spot between some trees and the back end of another truck. Driver's foot fumbles on the clutch, and his truck jumps a couple of feet forward and stalls out, pinning the first guy between his front bumper and the back end of the second truck. Guy was airlifted out. I never heard whether he made it or not. Story 140. This one time on the city council, the boys were on a run and picked up at the Sydney Hilton when a dumpster exploded. That was before I was born, let alone working on the council, but a dude I worked with survived it. Massive scars down his face. Not an accident per se, but it is about as bad as things get on the job. Story 141. Had a good friend/coworker get halfway scalped when a 2,200-pound stack of glass fell on him. The fact that it didn't hit his skull is amazing, but the stack hit him on the right side, about 2 inches above his ear. He's good now, has a little bit of a balance problem, and his ear isn't totally back where it should be, but he's alive. Story 142. I was at work and a coworker came running through the front doors naked and screaming. We are laughing and cheering him on as we thought he was quitting in the most hilarious way possible. Turns out that he smoked something laced and was in complete psychosis. When the cops came, he started to scream at them and say he was going to hit them. He attacked one of the cops and they hurt him, and he passed in the street. Story 143. Not mine, but that of a friend. He works moving large machines and components around, like the machines used in factories. He was installing a crematory, machine used to cremate someone. And the crane he was operating, holding the crematory up, lost hydraulic pressure, and the crematory came tumbling down on top of his friend's leg and hit his leg. He had to get it amputated. Story 144. Guy leaned over a railing on a scissors lift. As he leaned over his torso, hit the controls, and raised the lift, pinning him between the railing and a stationary object above. I don't remember if it was someone on the ground or the guy in the lift that got the thing to go back down, but came back down, sat down on the ground, and passed away from massive internal injuries. Poor dude. Story 145. I work for a roofing contractor, and we had a guy draining an asphalt kettle to clean it out. He didn't have his pants over his boots, as required by company policy, so when the container he was draining into failed, about 30 pounds of 400-degree asphalt poured down his leg and into his boot. It burned so deeply that it did tendon damage, and he'll never walk normally again. Story 146. I think this technically qualifies. One of our sections was shooting missions in support of combat operations in Iraq and Syria. It was nighttime, so after firing a round, one of the crew members couldn't tell the bore of the howitzer wasn't clear. They loaded another round and fired it, which caused the howitzer to explode, hurt 2 of our soldiers, and wounding others. Story 147. Anyone who has used an angle grinder will know that they sometimes catch. Someone I was working with was on a roof using one, and it jumped up and straight into his arm. Things skipped up and down his arm. Worst part was trying to get him down the ladder, as his arm was pouring blood. Story 148. I work security. Our guards wear a suit and clip-on tie. One of my coworkers decided the cheap clip-on was stupid, so he wore a regular black tie. He got into a fight. They grabbed the tie, which, if clip-on would have come off, hit him with it while punching him in the face. We work alone. Some random person helped my coworker out. Story 149. Not at my work, but at a friend's summer job a few years ago. She worked at a camping along the Swedish coast. One day there was going to be a boat trip or something. There was an old man handling the boat, and it was his last day of working on this boat. His foot got caught in the rope as the boat was pulling away. He lost foot. Story 150. I'm a nurse in a large residential facility for the developmentally challenged. One of the nurses didn't notice a resident approaching from behind, and he jumped on her and grabbed her face. He managed to get his fingers in her mouth and pulled from the corners. He ripped both her cheeks almost to her jaw. Think of Joker. Story 151. Actually nothing too bad like some deaths I read here. Once of our storage workers held a knife wrong cutting open packaging and accidentally hit into his own leg. Unfortunately, it was like the main artery and was rather critical to get him to a hospital. Luckily, the next hospital is literally 1.5 kilometers away, so all worked out. Story 152. About 20 years ago, one of the employees removed his harness to get a dishwasher box that was just out of reach. In my location and most stores, the appliances are stored in a loft about 50 to 100 feet up with the one open side to use an order picker, where you stand on an open platform with a harness on to retrieve the appliances. It wasn't company policy at the time to keep the harness on at all time, and he ended up falling from about a story up onto the concrete floor, broke most of the bones in his body. He still works in the store as a cashier and can't be fired now. Story 153. A car accidentally rammed into a tricycle outside my workplace, trapping the driver between another parked tricycle. If I remember, his leg had to be amputated and the girl inside the tricycle hit her head and passed away. First time I witnessed something so horrible. My grandmother, who was there, almost had a heart attack. Story 154. Someone was doing inventory. Then on a shelf, maybe like 25 to 30 feet on a rack, a dolly fell right on her head and knocked her out cold. The only thing she remembers is waking up in a hospital. She says she's trying to sue the company, but is having a hard time doing it. It seems like they don't want to pay her. Story 155. I do molding for car parts. 30-tone tool broke its lift pin while being craned. The Chinese guy under it didn't stand a chance. Previous job, metal stamping. Guy was working in a press. Safety interlocks failed, and the press cycled with him in it. Everything from the hips up was hit. Story 156. Small little accident at a coffee shop. Nothing grotesque, but someone dropped our huge container of freshly made mocha. It landed straight on the bottom of the container, meaning the mocha launched itself straight up and out of the container and covered the ceiling and menu boards, as well as the counter. Story 157. One guy was trying to wipe a plate on the printing press. Rag got caught and he tried to save it. Got his finger caught and lost his fingernail. Another guy was cutting chipboard down and apparently the machine malfunctioned when he tried to turn the stack and hit his fingers. Story 158. I've been a server since 16, so 5 years in the restaurant, and I've seen a few things happen, but by far the worst was when one of the cooks slipped and his hand dipped into a fryer vat. The scream horrified me, and I never saw that cook again. Story 159. Happened years before I started. But at the hotel I work, a guy came asking about the parking garage, how many levels it had, because he couldn't find his car. Turns out he was looking for the highest parking garage to end his life, and one of the valets or maintenance guys saw it happen. Story 160. Guy holding a tray of bacon fresh out of the oven. Hey boss, these look done to you? As he tilts the tray to show chef the bacon. Dude pours literally boiling oil all over his forearm. Skin sloughs off like a sheet. Lots of screaming, smelled like bacon and fried chicken wings. Story 161. Not the plant I worked at, but a guy was loosening clamps on a large vat tank, did not check the pressure gauge. It must have been around 100 pounds per square inch, blew the lid off and passed away. And that, my friends, is why we check for pressure. Story 162. One guy hit his head by an angle grinder blade and fell 20 meters, dead. One guy hit his belly with an angle grinder, not dead. And one guy was buried under tons of sand, dead. Couple of fatal car accidents. Story 163. Worked at Sam's Club. Someone on overnights left receiving going backwards on a forklift with the forks pointing forward. The overnight manager was driving his lift into receiving and was impaled. Thankfully, it was just his calf muscle. Story 164. We had a guy die once, but it was just some freak random thing. He fell off the back of a parked flatbed and hit his head on the pavement in just the wrong way. Not too interesting a story, but still sucks for him. Story 165. Train driver here. I heard a story from a fellow driver that after he hit someone and had to check his train once stopped, he saw the guy was on top of one of the locomotive's motors. Story 166. I work in a hospital with a tube system. When the system was first installed, someone put their arm in the tube as a joke. Yeah, lost the skin off his forearm. Those suckers have powerful suction. Story 167. Not too long ago, a subcontractor was working on the roof of one of the buildings, fell through a skylight to his death. He was wearing proper PPE harness, but wasn't clipped in. Story 168. Back in the 80s, someone dropped a lit match down the side of a wooden escalator, and it started a fire that hit 31 people, and they passed away. Story 169. I was the worst accident. I dipped my hand in the deep fryer while I was cleaning it. Surprisingly, it felt like dipping my hand into a jacuzzi until about 10 seconds later. Story 170. Last year, I fell into a hole inside the jet I work on. Floorboards can be removed to access storage space and other stuff. I broke a rib and bruised my spine. It sucked. Story 171. A few weeks ago, a guy lost his arm in our offset press. Ever see a newspaper printing press? They go a million miles an hour regardless of body parts and the fixing. Story 172. When I worked at Davy Tree down in San Diego, a dude fell 20 feet out of a tree onto a retaining wall and broke his face. He came back to work 6 months later. Story 173. Not sure if this counts because it's not a formal work setting and we all work together online over Discord. But I run a small hobbyist game dev, indie dev group, and one of the devs decided to dig up a build of our previous game from a few years ago that never left beta and was canceled. He ran the game and its online multiplayer system kicked in and tried to connect to our now defunct, as of 2017, account system for the game. Imagine running a program that runs itself again. You end up getting an infinite loop of a program, running a program that runs a program, which runs a program, and so on until your computer completely gives up. There are many ways to do this purposefully on Windows and Linux, and it's fun to do on school computers. This type of program is what we call a fork bomb, because the act of running a program from within another program, even if it's the same program, is called forking a process. What happened is, this old game would try to connect to our account server, which is dead, fail, and try to relaunch in an attempt to reconnect. Due to a bug, there was no limit on how many attempts it could try before the game would give up and present an error. So the game, due to us shutting down the servers, turned into an accidental fork bomb, and he did not see that coming. Hope he saved his work. He told me what happened, and I said this. Events like these make me ask myself, what lessons have I learned from this? So, buddy, what lessons have you learned from this? A few hours later, he replies back and says, I learned never to run our old multiplayer games ever again. Good. Story 174. I used to work in a sandwich shop and I was in charge one night. We were finishing up closing and most of us had put our mops away and we were checking the closing list off. One girl was still mopping. She went to put her mop away and she yelled my name. Apparently when someone else had put their mop away, it had fallen and turned the hose on full pressure and there were 3 inches of standing water in the mop room and all down the back hallway. When she yelled my name, I ran back there and slipped in the water and hit my head on the corner of one of the counters and hurt my knee pretty bad from the fall. We were there until 9, we closed at 7, getting all the water out. I was not seriously hurt, and I wasn't planning on telling my boss any of this, but I was opening the next day and I felt like he needed to know. He made sure I was okay, and now at the Christmas party every year, at least until I had quit back in January, he would always do trivia on the employees, and my question was always either, who was in charge of the Great Delhi Flood, or which employee got hit by a drunk driver / hit and run on her way home from the deli? My experiences there were crazy. Story 175. Nothing serious in terms of human cost, but I once worked a call center where in the spring some pipe burst underground, and when I came in from a smoke break, there was a torrent of water shooting up from under a row of cubicles. We had super high ceilings as it was located in a remolded grocery store. The jet of water was so strong it was hitting the ceiling and literally making it rain over half the center. It was absolute chaos. IT reminded me of the Darkest Timeline episode of Community because I left for 5 minutes and came back to a ducking hellscape. Management and agents were running everywhere, desperately trying to salvage the system, while every door in the building was propped open. Really strange because this was a stupidly secure environment. While scores of people did their best to push all the water out by whatever means they could. It was really something to see such a peaceful and calm environment go to hell so fast. It was really interesting to get a quick glimpse into how a large group responds to an emergency. Story 176. As a bunker surveyor, part of my duty is jumping from one ship to another so I can take sounding of both ships involved. Most barges, the ship which deliver the fuel, come with a crane and a basket for that purpose. Last week, I happened to start in the barge side, and while we waited for an engineer representing the vessel during the barge sounding, the master was talking with me about security measures. When I was up to tell him that this was meant to be basic safety knowledge, I noticed said engineer, who instead of hold himself, he was just sitting inside the basket. The master didn't say a word and just looked at him, clearly pissed. If falling to the water from 10 meters wasn't a risk, imagine risking falling in the 1 million gap between two ships. Story 177. I only worked for about a year and a half, but a girl was cleaning out the shredder, promptly turned off. But when she turned it back on, her tag, which she had on her neck, got stuck in there and started pulling her inside. Luckily, the string broke, but her hair got caught. Half of her hair was torn off. We only heard a loud scream, and then she came with the most horrifying facial expression I have ever seen, asking if it was bad. She doesn't work here anymore, as the company was not very cooperative while covering her mental damage from that experience. Story 178. A motor grader driver was parking for the day. He needed to cross the railroad tracks to get to the parking lot. As he was crossing the tracks in his motor grader, a freight train passed by. The driver survived, but the motor grader was completely destroyed. The motor grader fell about 10 meters from the tracks. The train was traveling at about 70 kilometers per hour. Story 179. A man suffered a leg injury from a hydraulic pallet jack, which probably weighed 2 tons. After extensive surgeries, he was fitted with an orthopedic boot, and he limped for several months before receiving disability benefits and, I assume, a substantial settlement. But it certainly wasn't worth it. Story 180, it's vacation related. I was surfing on Nisa Island in Indonesia when a local caught a wave that ended up getting sucked onto a coral reef. The guy was washed up on the reef and needed a helicopter evacuation. I'm not sure he survived. Story 181. I worked in a long-term care facility for people with intellectual disabilities. A woman scratched her arm while sitting in a wheelchair and developed a necrotizing infection. She lost her arm, but the facility tried to blame it on the fact that she had cancer several years before the injury. What's the worst mistake you've ever made at work? Story 1. Early in my career, I said, I don't need to write that down, I'll remember. I also marked a large amount, like 80,000, of capital gains as short-term instead of long-term when running an extension estimate for a tax return. My favorite mistake to make people feel better, though, is an old coworker who didn't know semi-weekly payroll tax deposit requirements were a thing until he got the first notice about failure to deposit on time from the IRS 6 months and 12 payrolls later. Story 2. I forgot $12 million of depreciation. Big startup, and the depreciation was in multiple Excel files. When the controller handed it over to me, I missed on sheet for the whole year. $1 million a month. Didn't catch it until I was pulling the depreciation info for the auditors. Soon as the auditors left, I demanded we get a FA system and spent the next 3 months setting it up. Story 3. I was up for promotion and got given like 3 in-charge roles during busy season. I forgot to test revenue for one client until the day of filing. I was wrapping the audit file and noticed no docs associated with a few revenue accounts. Told the controller to send me a bunch of stuff, and he yelled at me. Then the manager yelled at me. I didn't get promoted. Story 4. I was always decent on the accounting side, but when it comes to common sense, the numbers don't add up. This happened during my first week at work. I was printing something from this manual that was maybe 900 pages long. I wanted a specific page in the 700s or something, but instead of selecting the page number, I started printing 700 copies. Naturally, this wouldn't be a problem, but I decided to go to the break room to make some tea. By the time I came back, the printer ran out of paper and someone was loading more in. Mind you, this was one of those big Kyocera printers. I walked up to the printer and thought to myself, oh, someone must be printing something huge for a client or something. I'll grab my document later after it finished, and I'll help sort it. So it keeps going for a half hour or so, and it gives the out-of-paper noise. Eventually, it runs out of paper again and starts beeping. And what do? I confidently step in and refill it, because apparently I have the survival instincts of a potato. Mind you, the output tray is now overflowing, pages are sliding onto the floor like some kind of paper avalanche, and I'm just scooping them up and stacking them neatly on the side table, proud of myself for helping. Then a senior staff member walks over to print something real. He looks at the mountain of paper, picks one up, and says loud enough for the most of the office to hear, "Who the heck is printing hundreds of copies of the training manual?" It takes a moment to sink in, but then I realize it's me. I've also done crazier non-work related stuff at work, but I just remember this for some reason. Story 5, let's see. Tried to make a payment from a bank account that was closed, didn't know it was closed. Filed an extension for an entity with the wrong form type, sent owner financials to the wrong owner, typed in the wrong bank account number for a multi-million-dollar wire. I'm surprised I'm still employable, but I'm also human. Mistakes happen. Now you know better for next time. Story 6. Had a client who came in his last name was Italian. I tried reading it and I said, "No problem, Mr. Dookie." Apparently that wasn't the right what to pronounce it. Story 7. New clients, the husband and wife, both have formal names that have common nicknames like Jonathan, John, and Abigail, Abby. Those aren't the actual name. I used a nickname for the husband in an email and the wife berated me with a paragraph response just to tell me to use the full form. I responded by addressing the wife using her full name and apologizing. She responded again. I spelt her name wrong, and now she is questioning me if I will spell their names wrong on the tax return. And what else will I get wrong on the tax return? I look like a complete idiot, and obviously my boss is copied on all the emails too. My boss comes into my office and says, "Man, what a ducking Karen. But seriously, get their names right. You made us look bad. We have to get clients' names right at the very least." I responded to the client with humor, "I just can't seem to get out of my own way on this. I'm sorry." The husband then responds and is the nicest guy ever. A year later, I've saved them $30,000 in taxes versus prior accountant. They love me, and I'm calling them both by their nicknames every phone call and email. I owned it. Always own your mistakes and own them quickly. This may seem like a minor mistake, but it was a new client bringing in two 1040s, a 1041, and an 1120S with quarterly payroll. A good $7,000 to $8,000 per year client I almost lost on day one. Story 8. I had been working at a super small local firm, let them to go to a regional firm. This was huge for me. I was tasked with preparing a set of financials from scratch in Excel. Well, nothing balanced when I turned them in. Balance sheet didn't balance. Profit on P&L didn't match profit shown on balance sheet. I laugh now to think how dumb that was and what they must have thought. Story 9. I ducked up the back end of the entire audit by changing some crap at 1 a.m. after being overworked. I stayed up till 5 trying to fix it, but each change led to more and more errors, and then I basically said nothing, hoping it would kind of just go away. It did not go away. They were not happy. Story 10. Sent the e-signature with date format DD/MM/YY instead of MM/DD/YY. Somehow the controller blew up more over this than a coworker wiring $3.3 million to the wrong vendor. Story 11. November last year, my team made yearly revenue forecast number excesses by $8 million due to October revenue was calculated twice in the spreadsheet. Then our boss submitted it to headquarters. Then my team told my boss about the error. She exploded so bad. My team broke down in tears, stress time. Because if my boss missed the forecast number by a lot, it affects her KPI. So she told us to push next year AR to match the forecast. Fortunately, after pushing AR by the end of the year, somehow the actual matched the forecast perfectly. That excess $8 million was right. It was traumatic. I record the meeting when she exploded from memories. Story 12. My very first year in public, a client's email got hacked during a busy holiday season, and they were sending us emails pretending to be our client with invoices for large amounts that were urgent to be entered into Bill.com. I stupidly entered all those invoices, and one of them got approved and was released for payment. Luckily, Bill.com has that clearing account thing, so the funds left the client's account but never got deposited to the fraudulent account. It got caught because the manager for that practice group knew the client was on vacation and could not possibly be sending these types of invoices. The fraudulent emails coming through sounded exactly like how our client would type, so we figured the person who hacked it had been watching her email account for a while. I was lucky that my team understood, and I was not terminated for it. But the client never trusted Bill.com after that. Story 13. I was young and naive and overheard my as an on-site outsourced bookkeeper. I was making mistakes left and right, and the client was letting me have it. I snapped back at them, something along the lines of, "I told you multiple times I already did it. Check your email." The client fired us. Luckily, I kept my job. Not sure how. Story 14. I had just started as an accounting assistant at a small boutique film company. They had a CFO who was a CPA and my job was to assist him with invoicing, AP, and payroll. The company was small, with revenues around $1 million per year. I had 1 week of training and then was pretty much alone, doing my day-to-day tasks. We had a credit payment come through. I had not yet done any myself, but had been shown how the system worked. It was an automated phone system. The mistake came when I entered the payment as a credit instead of sale. It was presented as a credit payment, and the amount was for $250,000. It took a week or two before they realized something was way off in our company bank account. Story 15. My dumbest was just thoughtless, and it happened near deadline. I was working on a return. They had a large carry-forward NOL loss. It whipped out taxable income. I didn't have a setting on the Schedule C correct. I was looking at a $0 return with zero tax. Okay, no problem. The self-employment taxes on the current year income just didn't hit me, and the way the program was showing the Schedule C, I thought it was being reported. It wasn't. Story 16. I was editing the script of the CFO's commentary. On an earnings call, I accidentally input last quarter's adjusted number. Luckily, no one caught it when I started in AP 10 years ago. I fat-fingered a wrong account number, spent months trying to claw back the amount because the owner of the wrong account withdrew the money immediately and spent it, knowing it wasn't theirs, was about $5,000. Immaterial, but still a bad mistake. Story 17. I fully depreciated a copier that was like $30,000, but they didn't buy it. It was a copier lease. The partner didn't catch it. I also pushed through a return for a deceased client to be e-filed. The software didn't really allow that, and it deleted the name and address of the taxpayer. I didn't notice it and turned it in for review. Story 18. A senior accountant reformatted a spreadsheet that was used to set up wires to investors. The formatting was done incorrectly, but was near impossible to catch the error. Around $30 million was sent to the wrong investors. Story 19. If it makes you feel better, I was training this bum in advisory, and he had been with the firm for over a year. After having 6 years of experience in corporate accounting, he couldn't get the balance sheet to balance yet, the trial balance. Because he couldn't figure out the balance sheet, he didn't import it into the workflow, so basically nothing was done. Just dumped time into the project and asked a bunch of stupid questions and could never figure anything out. Wasting his time, my time, everyone's time. I worked with interns who were better. On top of that, he had already been promoted to senior. The level of incompetence at that firm was mind-boggling, but he knew what the hell they were doing. Story 20. Deleted the payroll data files on my first day at a job about 15 years ago. Immediately told my boss. I had the balls to come tell them, and they respected it. They would have fired my ass if I didn't fess up. I stayed for another 2 years there. Learned a valuable lesson that day. Almost anyone can be taught accounting, but a large part is admitting mistakes and learning from them. Story 21. I love my job, but can be less than aggressive. Year-end accrual processing is always a pain. I missed a 4mm capital accruals, but PMO covered for me and put blame on procurement. But the worst was freezing when a woman from out Tokyo office sent an email saying that I would handle accruals that normally were handled by each office. Don't know why I was so wimpy. Story 22. Not me, but a coworker once sent an email to a client containing the term public accounting, only she typed pubic instead. The email went out successfully. In story 23, 1. So I got this tax return that was so far over my head I literally had to consult with 2 people in my office, combined 30 years of experience to my 5. I then reported his income on the wrong form, so I know that numbers were off the previous year. But I was doing this guy's return again, and I had taken a CE class that was telling me something was wrong. So I researched it again and found the right form. NBD, right? Well, the dude was recovering from open heart surgery, and there was some back and forth. Somehow I added his current year income to the previous income, so it was untaxed. Dude got a decent refund. Year 3, I was out with RSV, and one of the previously mentioned tax preparers was assigned. She found my mistake, and it was like a $5,000 difference. Not that $4K was astronomical to the guy who paid $30K out of pocket for surgery or was pulling in multiple income sources. IDK how she fixed it with the client. 2. I was pretty new when COVID hit. We had really strict policies about people in the office. One woman who had been with the company for 10 years said, "It won't go until it's signed. So check the box that they signed so as soon as it's paid, we won't forget." Well, I had a coworker ask me to open a return and do something, not thinking I checked the box, as it had become habit. Well, this return had been messed up so badly. It was comped, so it's sent. The coworker called me up and yelled at me. I apologized for clicking signed. She was flipping out, and I just said, "I'm really sorry, but I made a mistake. It looked like one of the returns that needed to be paid for. I didn't realize that it was paid." She kept yelling for a good 5 minutes, and I just kept saying that I don't know what else she wanted to hear from me. 3. Businesses can take health insurance premiums against their income. ACA counts as paying for insurance. At least that one's my sister's return, and she's excited because it made like an $800 difference for only 1 year. I still have to go back and see what 2022 will tell me. I swear I am good at my job. Story 24. When I was a first-year analyst, I left a pitch deck at Kinko's for an overnight print and a final view, but didn't approve all items and track changes first. The proof copy looked fine, but the staff closed the file before printing all the copies, and it reverted to the track changes view when they reopened it. The proof copy was on top when I picked it up at 4 a.m. prior to my 6 a.m. flight for a 9 a.m. client meeting, and it looked clean, so we only found the error as we convened at the destination airport. The manager and I went to a copy shop nearby and did a very hasty print job, but got clean copies in time for the pitch, which we didn't win because we were never going to win it. Tax provision work for a Fortune 500 company when we were mid-tier tax at best. I flew home thinking I was getting fired, but somehow survived it. Thank goodness for partners with a sense of humor. Story 25. Accounting manager at a large hospital prepared a pledge receivable audit confirm for a very high-profile donor, like she was born into a family that anyone in the US would know, with the paid/amount due amounts flipped. This donor was already a snobby asshole and called me to complain about our shoddy accounting, and how dare we question her integrity by making her confirm her pledge. I owned up to it, but when I tried to explain that A, our books were correct and it was a manual error, and B, the auditors picked the sample and it was standard procedure for large pledges, she hung up and called the CFO. I thought I would fired for appearance's sake, which I wasn't, but he made me send her a formal apology letter. Thank goodness the auditors understood the sensitivity and agreed to special procedures without future confirmation. Story 26. Due to a miscommunication, a payment run went through twice. Thankfully, it was peak season, so had the money to spare. We sent remittance advices as standard for COS, so we allocated both payments in the system and emailed remits to the suppliers, explaining the situation. Thankfully, they were fine with it, and we tightened up the payment approval process. I accidentally submitted a tax return on the wrong year. We had a new software system, and the client was always late, so I included the information on the current, not previous tax year by mistake. Managed to submit the correct figures on the previous return, and resubmit the current return with amended figures. Story 27. Two of my biggest mistakes. 1. Sending a wire transfer of $10,000 for a fake invoice. Managed to get $4,500 of the funds pulled back. 2. Approving a landscaping contract for my employer's building that included an additional $15,000 of bushes, trees, and rock. Turns out, none of my employers actually read the contract before authorizing me to approve it. Story 28. Accidentally left a F500 exec to eat alone at a restaurant. In college, I won an accounting program raffle to have lunch with an executive of a local F500 company. There were 2 restaurant options. I waited at the wrong restaurant for 45 minutes before realizing my mistake. Ran to the right restaurant to find him sitting alone wrapping up his meal. Story 29. Copied and pasted an invoice number into the dollar amount when sending a wire, and accidentally sent over $230,000 for an invoice that was only like $100 and change. Of course, the vendor then refuses to send a refund for like 6 months. So it turned into a much bigger cluster duck than it needed to be. Story 30. Imagine spending extension deadline day preparing and filing several years of a client's return as a Schedule C, then finding out 2 weeks later that the supervisor had left notes saying the client should be retroactively treated as an S-Corp in all the filing. Story 31. Late on an 8K filing by a matter of minutes and lost WKSI status for the subsequent year. Really sucked, but we have good people and they were supportive and it turned out okay.